Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with
Dr. Jessie Mahoney
and Dr. Ni-Cheng Liang.
We are here to help you learn to pause and be present, awaken your breath, and harness the ripple effects of mindfulness for radiant health.
We get you. We know you. We are you.
We have both been successful on the surface, yet struggling underneath. We have both had cluttered brains, been overwhelmed, and exhausted.
We're healers who have found solutions and want to share them with you.
Join us here to discover a better way.
Welcome to our episode on parenting athletes with presence. A reminder that our podcast is not medical advice. We're offering a different twist in our Parenting with Presence series with this episode. And so let's begin. Our intention for today is to share ways that mindfulness and coaching will help you approach parenting your youth athlete.
We hope you will discover that mindful reflection and intention can help you parent in ways that empower your student athlete to be the best versions of themselves and make decisions about sports and their life from a place of strength rather than compare and despair, scarcity, and fear of missing out. Takeaways are that harder and more is not better for student athletes.
I wanted to share the backstory about this episode because it's actually very happenstance and somewhat lovingly amusing. So the inspiration for this podcast episode came when I had a conversation with your husband, Mark, incidentally at the Mindful Healers Connect in Nature retreat. While I was waiting for you, we got to talking about physical body height and sports. And I was asking about your boys, whether any were taller than Mark, since he is a rather tall person. And Mark said no, laughingly and lovingly, and said that you, Jessie Mahoney, were blamed for this. And I say this with loving amusement and jest, that you had been dragging down their height, but that
I have been blamed for this for years.
This is not new to you.
Many dinner conversations. This is not
new to you.
Yeah.
But that you had a very powerful comeback, that you are still the only Division I college athlete in the immediate family. And this amazed me because I thought I knew you pretty well. And here I was, like, you knew that I have been parenting a pretty serious athlete. And here you are having played D1 tennis at Dartmouth, and I had absolutely no idea. So this is an opportunity, Jessie, for you to share with our listeners this fascinating story that I have never heard. And I'm actually rather quite excited to hear about your athlete journey. And thank you so much for being open in sharing this and agreeing to this podcast.
I have to say I was hesitant when you asked me. And it's kind of interesting because I realize I really don't talk about it. And I really only use that comeback because I'm so tired of hearing about how short I am and how I've ruined all of their D1 careers because I gave them short genes. And so I'm like, wait a minute, like, you can't be mad at me. I'm the only one who's actually done this thing that you all want to do. And so I was thinking about it as you asked me about it. And I think the story is really complicated. And I think that's why I just kind of let it lie. There are so many really amazing things, which I'll share, and then a lot of really not amazing things that came from it. And the other thing that I think came up is when I use this D1 athlete to kind of tease my kids, because that's like the panacea. They all want to play D1 baseball. But I also have a little bit of imposter syndrome because I think of, like, Ivy Leagues are D1 technically, but they're not really, right? They're really academic institutions that happen to be D1 because of their size, or I don't even know what qualifies any of them as that. But I think I do have a little imposter syndrome because I'm like, yeah. And I also, as you'll hear, I didn't play that long for other reasons, and which actually are very aligned with this podcast, in that it became clear to me what my priorities were. And that's definitely influenced how I have tried to raise my boys, who all are very sports-minded and very determined and driven. So
can I also just call out, though? Can I call out that that we, in your imposter syndrome, about Dartmouth not being quote unquote really a D1 competitive sports school. I want to call that out because the label D1, it's D1.
I don't even know what it means.
Same thing with MDs and DOs. Like those are labels. Like even if you barely passed medical school, you're still an MD and DO. You're not really a doctor because of that. So I just want to lovingly invite you to own the D1 status.
Yeah. Well, and I will tell you, I own it very strongly at my kitchen table because of the height conversation. It's like, I'm really feisty about it, but outside of my house, I never talk about it. So what I was going to say is the beginning of my tennis story is actually, I think, wonderful, simple. I didn't even start playing tennis till I was 11. And I think my mom signed me up for a tennis lesson. And I will say this sheepishly, but I was really good, really fast. And I liked being really good at something. And so I just got all this sort of positive feedback. And I don't know why I was good at tennis. I'd done gymnastics before, which my body's not really gymnastics body at all. My body's actually very much a tennis body. So it kind of makes sense that it would have been something that really worked for me. And so my older brother, we've talked about him before, he's really good at art and he's a really good natural athlete. And so I'd always been looking for the thing that was going to make me really good. And so I loved tennis because of that, because all of a sudden I had this thing that I felt like I was very accomplished at. And the other thing that I loved about it is that while tennis is an individual sport, when you're working on your tennis, you do it more in groups. And I developed this community that was outside of my school. I don't know that I've talked about my school growing up, but I grew up in Berkeley and I went to an extremely funky, tiny school called Black Pine Circle. And there were about 18 kids per grade. And we started out in like an old stained glass factory and it was all Berkeley professors' kids. It was very, very hippie. And so even when you got to 6th, 7th, 8th grade, which is what we're talking about when I started, we still only had 18 kids in all of 7th grade. So for me to have a whole other community outside of that with boys and girls was really fabulous. I really appreciated it. And when you did tennis, these were kids from all over, different schools, different backgrounds. And so that for me was really fun. And I think it gave me this sense of belonging and pride that I think is so important for kids. And I think that's one of the things that sports for kids is really helpful at. And so I also got to travel, which was super fun. You get invited and then, you got to go by yourself, which I had never really had that opportunity. And I also had a very good friend, who I was thinking about. She was actually much better than I was, and she ended up playing for Berkeley. But she came from a Filipino family, and her dad used to drive us to tournaments, and they had this huge extended family up in Sacramento, and a lot of the tennis tournaments are in Sacramento. And so I would go with them, and then I would go to their family dinner where they would all speak Tagalog, which I didn't understand. But it was really a cool experience to kind of just throw yourself in the midst of these places. And so I will say that tennis really brought me all of that, not just the tennis and the sports. And I have noticed that actually these days that's not so much true because most parents actually go with their kids and then we have the team dinners. And so I, as a parent, and we'll talk a little bit more about being a parent of an athlete, I actually send my kids a lot with other people. In part because I found that really valuable, and in part because when you have 3 kids, it takes a lot of energy to go to all the things. And so I found a lot of value in that. The other thing that I thought about is that one of the reasons my parents sent me with other people is they weren't that into sports. So my parents were really into academics. And so even when I was like, maybe I could play in college, it was like, well, you can only play at these places. They didn't care about that. That was just not their thing. And it's funny because they're super supportive of my boys now, many, many years later, but that was just their bent. And that was the way that I was raised. And so I actually think it was really helpful because it was my thing. It was always my thing. Like I had to ask and push and say, no, I really want to do this thing. And I think that really helped me actually be better and stronger and learn to advocate. So I actually appreciate that piece. The other piece that I really appreciate as I thought about this, and I didn't really think about it at the time, is I was in super good shape and I wasn't really trying to be. I just loved it. And so I was exercising all the time. And I think as a female, that was really good for me. Like I wasn't really thinking about what I look like or, anything like that. I was just doing it for the pure joy of doing it. And I feel like that's a hard thing to find in life. And so tennis really brought me that. And then thinking about the downsides, I actually had, and I didn't tell you this, but I actually had knee surgery in high school because I tore my meniscus playing tennis in my junior year. And so I went to my junior prom with said husband on crutches in an immobilizer right prior to my surgery. And so it's just kind of a funny story that these things do happen along the way, in addition to the story that we'll talk about later in my 30s and the thoracic outlet obstruction that came from this tennis career. So I was thinking about, kids who play in high school and all of those things that I mentioned, I think are really, really valuable. And they were really valuable to me. So I also in high school did a lot of tennis outside of school. It's kind of like, we didn't have travel anything in those days, but it was a similar version to that. And so there was a lot of independence. And I didn't go through like the recruiting process per se, in that it helped me get into Dartmouth. I know that, but I had to go and try out. And probably a big part of that was because of that knee surgery. So I was out my whole junior summer rehabbing, and then I went back, which actually maybe took some of the pressure off too, I would say, in that sense. So when I got to Dartmouth, they have tryouts in the fall, and I played in the fall, and then we hit winter in the Northeast. And I am a California tennis player. I had never played tennis indoors. I had never played tennis when it's snowing outside. I'd never had to walk 1.5 miles to the indoor tennising. And I just will say, first of all, it wasn't as much fun. The other thing that I found, and this is something that I think is really important for people, is that it's really hard to play a sport and be a pre-med and go to school and be a college student. And I also had a boyfriend who wasn't at the same school. Like there were a lot of competing demands. And so while the tennis was fun, and I actually was thinking, I had this one super fun memory. Both my grandparents have passed, but my grandfather went to Harvard, and they live about halfway between Dartmouth and Harvard. And when we played Harvard, it was the only time he ever came to watch me play, but he wanted to watch me play Harvard. And I lost, but he was super proud. And I still have this vision of him. He actually died about a year later of colon cancer. But I have this vision of him, like he couldn't have been more proud. And so that was really a moment. Like it's something I still remember, his exact face in that moment. And so I do think these things can bring you connections and other such. So I really played my freshman year. I actually played half of my freshman spring, and then I got mono, which happens in college. And then sophomore year, I will tell you, I decided not to keep playing. And because when you play college sports, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate this, you miss tons of classes. You spend a lot of time on a bus. And while there's great things about it, you really miss out on your college experience. And so I often tell people, you really want to think about it. Now, I think it also adds like tremendous networking and communication and teamwork. So it's pluses and minuses. And I think for each person, you have to decide what works for you. I will say, looking back, for me, that was the right decision. And I don't regret it. And actually, given what happened, it was probably even more of a right decision because I would have had more issues earlier on. For me now, I have 3 boys who are baseball fanatics. 2 of them actually had injuries, but could have played college baseball and did the whole travel ball, all the things, all the recruiting, all of that. And I have 1 who's still doing it and still really wants to play. And he, as the youngest, probably is the one who is going to play because the youngest is always the most determined. And so navigating that, and even this morning we were navigating emailing coaches and all that fascinating stuff. So I do think even in that recruiting process, kids learn a ton. Like my son is actually having to email the Johns Hopkins coach and to explain about this and explain about his class. It's like, and so he's asking me, is this an okay email? They learn all kinds of great adult skills through the process. So that's been fun. And then I will say the other reason I decided to humor you and do this podcast is that, as a pediatrician, I took care of tons of athletes, and sort of during their course, and watching how parents approach sports and playing in college, and how kids approach it, and how coaches approach it, and how schools approach it. I'm actually quite opinionated about it, having seen sort of different paths through it. And I think many parents are not as mindful about it as they should be. And there's tremendous benefits, but there's also tremendous risks and harm, both physical and emotional. And so I think it's really important, if you have an athlete, to be very mindful and intentional and present and rational about the process, if that makes sense.
Yes. And so the parallel here is that I'm parenting a competitive athlete. And incidentally, the sport of choice is one that my husband and I have played and also continue to play. And from a very young age, my eldest started watching my husband play because I had actually been out of volleyball for over 10 years and just recently got back into it. And my eldest has been playing for a competitive club travel team and has been for the last 4 years. And I think also why it was important for this podcast to come up was because it's the off season right now. My eldest season concluded back in June. And I have to say that I was really surprised, and also not surprised at the same time, that the offering of the schedules for all the different clinics and workshops and camps and the offerings for private lessons and semi-private lessons, I thought it was quite a lot, and it was like too much. And so that being said, at the time of registration, though, my eldest did vocalize desire to do many of these sessions. But when we actually got to doing them, I wanted to ensure now, while we're in the midst of it, that I give my eldest permission to opt out of some of the sessions to simply rest, because otherwise it was just so overfull. And so bringing in the mindful intention and some of the lessons that you yourself had touched upon, going into August and the fall season before tryouts for yet another club season, I'm planning on gently facilitating to coordinate a schedule that allows for more space and for true ample rest and recovery. And so I think at this point, Jessie, it's a good time for you to share a little bit more about what happened when you were 35.
Yeah, and I just want to comment on the rest and recovery again, which is something we bring up for physicians and bring up for all humans, right? We tend to not value rest and recovery, and yet professional athletes know that. And I think when we have a lot of kids wanting to make it, right, they don't do the rest and recovery, and then they get injured. And it's really important for your long-term physical and mental health. And you mentioned all the clinics and stuff. And these days, like being a college athlete is a business. And a lot of people actually spend all the tuition scholarships that they're going to get beforehand, getting their child to get one of those scholarships with all of these clinics and this and that. And so I think it's just, it's really hard, I think, to opt out. And there's so much fear that a little bit like the idea of opting out of leadership roles that people offer you early on. If you don't do it, you'll never get another chance. And so I think it's the brave, courageous, and harder decision to rest and recover. And so what happened to me when I was 35 is that I acutely developed thoracic outlet obstruction. And thoracic outlet obstruction, we have that outlet that has the scalene muscle and a nerve and an artery and a vein that run through it. I think I might not have my anatomy exactly correct. I know there's a vein because what happened was my scalene muscle became so overdeveloped due to tennis. And this is actually what the vascular surgeon said. And they said it was actually one of the most overdeveloped scalene muscles they'd ever seen. It compressed the subclavian vein completely, and I clotted off my whole right arm. as a mom of two young kids. I think my kids were 4 and 8, something like that. And in pediatrics, actually, I was working, and I asked all my colleagues, like, what do you think this is? We don't see clots in pediatrics. And everyone had a different opinion about why my arm was like swollen and puffy and all of these things. And so it ended up being a really significant problem. And I ended up in the ICU multiple times, getting TPA, trying to clear the vein. And ultimately, I ended up having to have a rib resection on heparin, and I had all kinds of complications because that's what happens to doctors. And so I ended up having a bleed and some nerve damage that actually impacted my medical career going forward. And so I think there's a lesson here in that it isn't that I could have ever known. It isn't that, they thought that this happened because I actually kind of got out of shape during medical school and when I was having my babies. And then when they got a little bit older, I decided to get back in shape. And that was the thing that tipped it over the edge. And so when I started getting back in shape, that scalene muscle grew just a tiny bit more, and that was it. Where it had probably been like borderline forever. So I also wonder, had I kept playing through college, this probably would have happened then. And it is something that happens very commonly. I will say to volleyball players, so keep your eye out, any overhand sport, volleyball players and pitchers in particular. And so I have, of course, warned my children that not only did they get my height, they also got my thoracic outlet size, probably. And so to be aware of that. And I think it isn't a reason not to do it, but I think many of us don't think about these long-term complications and potentially how they could impact your life. And would it have happened anyway? I have no idea. But they were very clear. They were like, what sport did you play? Because I hadn't had this conversation with them. And that was what they asked me when I woke up. I was like, what sport did you play? I've never seen a scaling muscle like that.
And it was because you had trained for so long and so hard that the scalene muscle was so strong and developed. But then conversely, while you were a fantastic tennis player, it ended up later on causing potential harm.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that's, while it's true of anything, I think sometimes we don't know that. And I will say that 2 of my children who were pitchers both actually have long-term injuries that either will require surgery or limit their activities for life. And one of the funnier things is my mom picked tennis because she thought it was something you could play lifelong. And while that might be true, I actually cannot play anymore. That's one of the consequences of that I can't do any overhand sports at all. Even though I don't have the rib because of the nerve damage and other stuff that happened during the surgery, I can't play for the rest of my life, which is fine. There's lots of other things I can do. It's not a huge problem. But I think it is important and something that many of us discount and don't even think about.
Mm-hmm. And so shifting to the parenting your sons, how's your experience as being a D1 athlete along with the thoracic outlet obstruction journey? How have you and how do you continue to parent your sons and the sports?
I try to be rational. I like to think I'm rational. I don't know if I am or not. I think our own judgment of rationality is perhaps biased, but I think that I am probably much more cautious in terms of how they train. When I trained, actually, we didn't lift weights. No kids lifted weights. But as a pediatrician, I see tons of kids lifting weights. And I actually remember my oldest, when he was in high school, they had them like really lifting weights. And I got super upset. I was like, you're not allowed to do that. We had to have a compromise with the coach. But I think that even coaches don't understand that. And so for me, that was just super triggering. Like, you can't do that. That's going to cause problems. But I also see the benefit. And I also see, for me, the tremendous value of kids playing sports in high school. I think for that sense of belonging and sense of community and developing a sense of self and independence, it's super valuable. And I think probably, I don't know this for sure, but I think it really is protective against a lot of mental health struggles, because you have a community and you attach value to how you're doing. I know if you are really struggling, maybe it causes issues, but for the most part, I see those kids as being much more engaged in their community and feeling like they belong. And I think my kids actually, if you ask them, and I often say these stories, like they probably thought that I didn't push them enough and that I wouldn't agree to do, like, I'm actually pretty much like, no, you need to take time off. And they never wanted to go on vacation because, you know, it was this tournament or this thing, and summer's a real baseball thing. And I always was like, nope, we're going, to the chagrin of them. And I got a lot of flack. And I will say that, you know, none of them so far has been a D1 athlete. Liam might be a D3 athlete. That would be my guess. Although maybe there's a couple of schools that might fit in that Dartmouth category of the, you know, so we'll see. But, and is that due to my reticence or hesitance? It could be. But my older two actually say that they are super grateful that they played in high school, and they were super grateful that they were trying to do this because it gave them a goal and it kept them really focused. And they're both super grateful that they did not play in college. One of them went to UC San Diego and the other one went to Berkeley. And they really, as they watched friends play in college, they were like, I'm so glad that I didn't do that. And I'm so glad I had a full college experience, which I know is not true for everyone. So I don't think there's a right way or a wrong way to do it, but I think being really intentional and to try not to be reactive to whatever's sort of pressuring you, whether it be a negative experience like I had, or a positive experience, and sort of this dream sort of dropping all. I also think it's really important not to sacrifice your family for sports. And that's something that I have tried really hard to do, because I have 3 boys, and when 2 of them were playing travel baseball, you could never have a weekend together, right? Because they would always have a tournament. Someone would be traveling with one, someone would be traveling with the other, and then the third one was just being dragged along. And so I do think it's really important to be really thoughtful about what's happening and how, and making sure your kids are okay, and making sure their mental and physical health is okay is also really important. So I think there's a lot of things to think about, and that this, you know, extreme drive in the high school, college age can impact, like, we all have long lives, and we want to think about the whole outcome. If that makes sense.
So, having been through what you have gone through, and also with your sons, in summary, what tips do you have for me and for our listeners who are in the midst of parenting athletes?
I think, well, for you, you don't need this one, but you should lean into it, is your mindfulness. Because I think when we're mindful, we can trust ourselves and trust our gut. And I think we actually have a lot of good wisdom about our children if we pause, step out of this sort of constant noise about it, and figure out like what you think is best for your child. And you can have conversations with them. But I have had teenagers try to run me over, mine in particular, and tell me why I don't know what I'm talking about. And I think it's really important to be really mindful and thoughtful about what works for you and what you think is good for them. So being balanced, mindful, intentional, and realizing too that every kid's journey is different and every family's journey is different. I think a lot of people think there's a way to do it. And I would say individualize it for your family, and constant checking in. Is it healthy physically and emotionally for your kids? And honestly, for you too. Many of our listeners are physicians. And so we have a lot to balance. Like, is it healthy for the family unit? What are you sacrificing? And is it worth sacrificing? And then really looking at the long game and seeing that, like, college sports, I think everyone sees it as like a panacea, and that's the best thing you could do. And I would say there's good and bad, there's costs, and there's significant benefits. I do think that for people for whom it works out well, and it works for their body and their family and all of those things, there are tremendous benefits from the networking and the sort of people have, when you're looking for jobs, they are like, oh, that person is really determined and motivated and makes things work. And so there are things about it that can be really helpful long-term.
And so I also wanted to add in that all of our youth athletes are on their own journeys, and there may be a tendency or an urge to want to compare. Why isn't my student athlete X, Y, and Z, or wanting to change a particular outcome, like a really tough loss, or not making a certain level of a team, for instance. But just to remind everyone that all of our kids are on their own journeys, and part of parenting is that we're trying to support and unconditionally love throughout this journey in a way that is conducive to raising an adult. And so allowing them to grow up, allowing them to fail forward with unconditional support and unconditional love is sometimes the harder path, and yet it's the right path in order to raise an adult successfully.
I mean, our ultimate goal, I always say, is to raise mostly responsible, happy, healthy humans. And one thing that you brought up there that I think is actually really fantastic about youth sports, if you use it for that, is it's a beautiful way to develop your relationship and have conversations about difficult topics, and have conversations about living in alignment, and have conversations about, fear of missing out and scarcity mindset and compare and despair, and how the world works in terms of, I often say, well, some people are making a living by offering these camps. That's why they tell you have to go, right? It makes sense. And it's not that they're wrong or you're wrong, but everyone needs to kind of figure it out. It doesn't mean you have to do it. So I think it's a way for them to learn about the world, and a way for you to actually grow your communication and connection. And as you said, to fail and to make mistakes. It's a great place to do that.
So as always, we like to end our podcast with some reflection questions. So how is your child athlete? And how are you?
Can you intentionally build in more moments of rest, connection, and presence around your sports journey?
How can you empower your child to say no and to opt in and rest?
And is where you are in your sports journey healthy for you and your child and your family? And how can you stay out, notice and stay out of the fear of missing out, scarcity, compare and despair, and really perhaps fear of failure too, wondering what will happen? Like, how can you stay in alignment during the process and all continue to grow and learn as a result of it? So we want to thank you for listening, hoping you enjoyed our thoughts, my experience, and both of our experiences raising children who love sports. And we wish all of you lots of love, connection, and fun. Actually, we didn't even mention that, fun along the way, because that really should be a big piece of it. And I will be offering Parent with Presence again towards the end of October. That's usually when I offer it every year. And so for those of you who want to parent with more presence and or are going through this journey, I think the coaching and mindfulness tools around parenting are incredibly helpful in helping you stay equanimous and balanced along the way.
And if you are in healthcare and aren't already part of the Mindful Healthcare Collective, please check us out at our Facebook group by the same name, and also at mindfulhealthcarecollective.com. Thank you, Jessie, for being open and vulnerable and sharing this fascinating part of your life that I had no idea about. And for all of you listeners, please stay on after the sound of the singing bowl for the mindful moment offering.
As always, if you want to declutter your mind, be more present, and start truly living your one wild and precious life, come find us at the mindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Work with one of us.
Work with both of us.
Start or uplevel your mindfulness practice.
Discover how mindful coaching can change your life.
Or even better, do both as part of our Mindful Healers programs and retreats. You can find links to find out more about our programs and join our communities at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
Reach out and get started on your journey to a life better lived today.
The content of this podcast is not meant to be medical or life advice. If you choose to participate in our mindful moments, please do so safely.
Welcome to today's mindful moment, a moment to pause, breathe, and reflect. Reflect on how you have been showing up, how you've been showing up for yourself and for others, and whether you feel like you are in alignment with your actions, wishes, and relationships. Take a moment to find your sit bones, your ischial spines, and connect them into your seat if you are sitting. If you are driving, please opt out. If you're standing, pause and notice the soles of your feet on the earth. Perhaps wiggle your toes, connecting each toe to the floor or earth below you. And pause once again. Pause and breathe. Breathe in through your nose, long, smooth. And out through your mouth. And in through your nose. And out through your mouth. If it's available to you and comfortable, close your eyes. When we close our eyes, we bring our mind and body into the same space with more ease. Coming back to the breath once again. And one more inhale in through your nose. And out through your mouth. And bring a hand to heart and the other hand to top. Pressing the heel of your hand into the heart space and the whole palmar surface of your hand towards your chest. And the top hand, place the palmar surface of the top hand onto the dorsal surface of the lower hand. And pause and notice how you feel. If possible, keep your eyes closed and come back to the breath, in through your nose and out through your mouth. Noticing hand on heart, pressing in gently into the heart space, connecting with your heart underneath. And taking a moment to reflect on where you are in your life and where you are in your relationships. And if you have children, your thoughts about them and what they're working on, your worries, your hopes, your dreams. And notice whether you're coming from scarcity mindset. Notice if you're pushing your kids because of something you think they might miss out on, or if you think it's an important thing to do as a parent. And coming back to your breath, breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. And taking another moment to notice whether you are acting with intention when it comes to your family and how you spend your time. Breathing in and breathing out. Do you feel aligned in your family and work life or overwhelmed? Are your activities and your kids' activities bringing you joy and pleasure and connection and learning and growth? Do they add to your family's experience or detract? How much of your family time do you want to dedicate to activities for kids? Are you taking enough time for the things that matter most to your family unit? Are the sacrifices that you're making in alignment for you and your family? Are the dreams still a dream? Pausing and breathing. And thinking about excitement, the things that excite you, the things that bring you joy, the things that bring you pleasure, the things that make you feel alive. And notice whether your kids who are doing activities, do they seem to be having joy, pleasure, and feeling alive when they're training and playing? And perhaps making a decision for today and today only, how you would like to proceed for the next few months as a family. What is your family priority? What do you want to do more of? What brings the family joy? Is there anything you'd like to do less of or differently? Maybe it's not changing your actions, it's just changing the thoughts and energy around the actions. If you knew it was going to turn out beautifully no matter what, how would you feel about where you are now? Breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. What would your future self, when your kids are grown, 18, going off to college, wish you had done now? Not knowing how it will turn out, but just knowing it's turned out okay. What will that version of you recommend that you do more of now or less of now? Taking in another long, deep breath. Connecting with that heart space and remembering that you can trust yourself. With your eyes closed, hand on hand, hand on heart. Listen to that intuition. Listen to your heart space. Listen to what you want. Listen to what you know about your children. Trusting yourself, your intuition, all the things. Taking in a deep inhale through your nose and out through your mouth. And perhaps setting an intention for the fall, how you would like to show up for your family, for yourself, for your children, for the activities, for the other families involved. Coming back to the breath. When you're ready, lower your hands and open your eyes, coming back into the light. And a moment to accommodate, a moment to transition, a moment to notice the calm and the grounded. Connecting with some of those thoughts that you had, taking a moment to notice what you learned, appreciating it. Thanks so much for practicing with me today. We'll see you next week.